Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents I'd Fight the World, a political history of old-time, hillbilly, and country music, by Peter Chapelle. Narrated by Chris Abernathy. Introduction. The Ghost of Tom Watson. Country music was political even before it became country music. When 19th-century Americans came together at camp meetings, medicine shows, mountain hoedowns, and plantation gatherings to dance and make music, the resulting satire, grudges, visions, and desires couldn't help but spring up. American politics, too, couldn't help but take on a show business air with its dramatic stump speeches, lurid smear campaigns, and theatrical torch-lit parades. Indeed, for many rural Americans, a passing political campaign was the only entertainment in town, metaphorically and literally. Perhaps more than others, Tom Watson, a fiddler-politician who would later emerge as a leading populist, seemed to sense that political campaigns and musical performances appealed to common aspirations, a desire to escape one's woes, to indulge fantasies about vanquishing tormentors and foes, and to find fellowship with like-minded individuals who dreamed of brighter times. In the old days long ago, when I was as poor as a church mouse, struggling to earn enough to keep myself fed and clothed, the evenings were almost intolerably lonesome, Watson said about his bleak beginnings in the 1870s as a country lawyer. So I bought me a fiddle, and I can never tell you how much comfort and consolation and satisfaction I got out of it. When the outlook was gloomy and clients were few, once in a while I would strike a bright chord which would fill me with hope, and the vexations and trials of the day would vanish. A decade later, when Watson was running for a seat in George's House, he performed a few songs at a debate. He realized that his fiddling could speak to similar longings in others, and that this might make it a potent political weapon against his opponent. You should have seen the look of silent despair on that good man's face as he stood in the corner of a room, while I sat on a box, like a king on his throne, and made my own fiddle talk, while the boys and the girls danced to my music, Watson said. I tell you, a fiddle is a big help in a fight. Watson was to become a household name for his fiery brand of populist politics. He railed against the bullies of the day, monopolist railroads, banks, rich, corrupt politicians, and worked with the Colored Farmers Alliance to promote the idea that blacks in the South should be allowed to vote. He argued that poor whites and blacks had been set against each other by the ruling classes to keep them both economically disenfranchised. Later, in the face of consumerism and modernism's invasion of the quiet rural wood, Watson would make a 180-degree turn, setting his wrath against Jews and blacks and making conspiratorial accusations against Catholics, even as he drew closer to pacifist and socialist thinkers. Watson's life yields a story like none other. What is most stunning about his story is its resonance with the themes that arose when country music became involved in politics across the 20th century and into the 21st. Watson's early overtures of racial harmony were echoed in the mid-20th century by racially liberal performer-politicians such as Idaho's singing cowboy senator Glenn Taylor and Alabama Governor Big Jim Folsom, who rarely ventured out on the trail without a string band. Watson's defense of the poor and the disempowered reverberated in the 1930s in a groundswell of country music campaigners such as promoter-songwriter W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel, who fought for pensions for the elderly and attacked poll taxes for holding back poor whites. Senatorial candidate and car manufacturer Henry Ford, who financed a revival of old-time music and square dancing in the late 1920s, partly with the aim of curtailing Jewish influences on American culture, seemed to draw much of his own playbook from Watson's anti-Semitic screeds and conspiratorial yellow journalism. Watson's penchant for scapegoating African Americans and defending segregation during his 1920 campaign for Senate went places that segregationist candidate George C. Wallace and his Grand Ole Opry campaigners did not in his gubernatorial and presidential races in the 1960s and 70s, but the same spirit seemed to animate both men. Near the end of his career, Watson seems to have hired others to play on his behalf, and he was memorialized in a recorded song, Fiddlin' John Carson's Tom Watson special. Today, recorded music is the norm at rallies. Campaigns seem incomplete without appearances and endorsements by superstars such as Willie Nelson, Hank Williams Jr., and Ralph Stanley, who sometimes find that, yes, a fiddle can still be a big help in a political fight. Country music politics is still haunted by Tom Watson. That specter continues to hang over those who use country music to further their political careers. In the 20th century, country music was not just a campaign tool, but a valuable political asset, and at times, a central component of a politician's image and identity, not just among Southern politicians, but also Westerners, Midwesterners, and even a few fleeting Easterners, such as hair tonic salesman Edward Doc Bowen, who ran for Congress in the 1930s in the counties just north and east of New York City. In the wrong hands, though, country music could be used by opponents to assail a candidate's seriousness or fitness for office. Scholars have filled volumes on the connections between cultural politics, political activism, and genres and subgenres ranging from early Tin Pan Alley to late hip-hop. Some have dismissed country music as largely parochial and conservative or even apolitical, while extolling the political messages of these other forms. Yet the actual historical record shows that when politicians have used music to get elected and push issues, country music was by far the most politicized. Between 1878 and the turn of the 21st century, country music and its predecessors and related genres, old-time fiddle, cowboy, hillbilly, and bluegrass music, were central aspects of campaigning for more than a dozen major party governors, several congressmen, at least 7 U.S. senators, a Senate minority and a Senate majority leader, as well as major third-party candidates. Watson and Senator Glenn Taylor were vice presidential candidates for the Populist and Progressive parties, respectively, and Governor George Wallace was the presidential nominee of the American Independent Party. By the 1970s, Richard M. Nixon officially welcomed country music into the White House when he inaugurated a National Country Music Month, and country music influenced one of his television commercials in his bid for re-election. Every president since has used country music or associations with country music in some way or another during their campaigns. Understanding the connection between country music and electoral politics gives us a glimpse into how politicians used celebrity long before the rise of the movie actor president and the Twitter president, and it offers both lessons and warnings about the way politics and entertainment interact in our ever-expanding media universe. Indeed, several generations before the rise of Hollywood performer politicians such as Helen Gahagan Douglas, Ronald Reagan, and George Murphy in the mid-1940s and 1950s, country music politicians have become an established part of the national political system, especially in the West and the South. The use of country music on the campaign trail has changed over time. Transformations in technology are an important part of this story. The earliest practitioners, like Watson, were country lawyers with dreams of high political office who also happened to have amateur fiddle skills. They were country politics' experimental pioneers, relying on word of mouth and the sound of a fiddle to draw or hold a crowd. Over time, new technologies such as phonograph recordings and radio created opportunities for performers to professionalize. Some of these performers then sought to capitalize on their celebrity and run for office. Other new technologies, such as the sound truck in the 1930s, provided opportunities for politicians to draw larger and more enthusiastic crowds. By the 1940s, the growth of a national country music industry allowed non-performing candidates to latch on to particular hit songs to sell their message, or to hire nationally renowned stars from the Grand Ole Opry to pitch for them at rallies and campaign stops. Television, too, reshaped the way candidates used country music, allowing them to not only celebrate the genre, but also use recorded songs at broadcasted rallies. Specially prepared slogan songs and TV spots became part of their media barrage. Though technological advances opened new ways to campaign with country music, politicians and performer politicians have shaped American history with their policies. Some country music politicians made courageous policy decisions. There is also much to regret. choices that were made for political expediency, prejudiced reasons, and personal benefit, and not for profound moral or ethical reasons. What marked them all was combativeness. Indeed, the title of this book stems from a 1962 country song by top Nashville songwriters Hank Cochran and Joe Allison, in which the singer pledges he would fight the world for the woman he loves, regardless of how others see him. That song, first popularized by Jim Reeves and later covered by a host of country and soul performers, has a kind of inward-looking domestic focus, like many songs of the period, perhaps with a thought toward the threat of an atomic attack that might, as the song says, turn the moon to ashes. Yet it also embodies defiance, not backing down, standing up for one's views, but also being obstinate, a quality present among many country music politicians. Some politicians have pushed forward with risky, courageous, forward-looking stances, while others clung to positions that now seem vindictive, incendiary, and callous. Hollywood has inflamed other prejudices by disseminating stereotypes about Southerners to warn that country music could be used deceitfully. In "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?", the rural electorate is painted as gullible fools, taken in by the country bands of a white-suited Southern kingpin, an amalgam of Huey Long, Pappy O'Daniel, and maybe Jimmy Davis, and of a Ku Klux Klansman who disguises himself as a political reformer. Robert Altman's Nashville doesn't offer much better, with its omnipresent and enigmatic sound truck that drives around belting out seemingly disconnected attacks on targets as varied as farm subsidies, the legal profession, and tax exemptions for religious groups. Particularly prickly were Altman's depictions of Music Row royalty, such as a morally sketchy older performer, perhaps based on a real-life figure such as Tex Ritter or Hank Snow, who records a ridiculously trite patriotic number. A generation earlier, a face in the crowd suggested that country music was so powerful it could gull voters into electing an ostensible fool and wannabe tyrant. It is a shame that the motion picture industry hasn't also told the stories of Big Jim Folsom and Glenn Taylor, who used the genre to try to open a new chapter in politics, especially in regards to civil rights. Big Jim's real-life mop and bucket for scrubbing the Capitol clean of corruption are referenced in Oh Brother as a broom of reform, ready to sweep this state clean, but they are attached to a candidate who is secretly a prude, a bigot, and a Klansman. Wouldn't it be just as compelling to see a singing cowboy senator arrested for attending an interracial, civil rights-oriented gathering in Birmingham, Alabama, as Taylor was in 1948? Or Big Jim facing death threats for inviting a black congressman into the governor's mansion? Many believe that the rise of country music in post-World War II national political campaigns demonstrates the Southernization of politics. There is certainly truth to this contention, but history shows us that country music politics is not solely a product of the South. Henry Ford in the Upper Midwest and John R. Brinkley in the Central Midwest formidably shaped the role of country music in political campaigns. Western performer politicians such as Stuart Hamblin and Glenn Taylor also made their mark, reflecting an almost genre-wide obsession with old-age pensions, or as Taylor pushed, progressive internationalism. The larger Southern diaspora certainly ensured a welcome reception for country music politics, but Ford and Taylor in particular produced manifestations that were uniquely linked to their home regions. That said, the extent to which country music campaigning became the norm by mid-century in Alabama and Tennessee, and perhaps to a lesser extent in Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida, cannot be overlooked. Alabama politicians especially had so taken to using country bands on the campaign trail by the early 1960s that country had begun to have national repercussions in presidential campaigns. Though the genre influenced the course of political history in many ways, this book is chiefly concerned with three types of country music politicians: amateur musicians, such as Watson and Tennessee's Taylor brothers, and later Senators William C. Byrd and Al Gore Sr., who used their musicianship to attract voters or shape their public image; professional musicians and promoters of hillbilly and country music, who used their celebrity to seek office, performing music on the campaign trail, non-musician politicians, such as Folsom and Wallace, who employed country musicians to perform at rallies and media events, and who used the genre to create public images that they believed resonated with voters. Nearly all these political actors were white outsiders who railed against the abuses of more powerful and more entrenched white elites. Some, such as Paul B. Johnson, Jimmy Davis, and Glenn Taylor, stemmed from truly destitute backgrounds. Some hailed from the wrong side of town or wrong region of the state, or were attacked by opponents for being frivolous performers unfit for political office. Nearly all these figures singled out their opponents as untrustworthy and undemocratic power brokers. Many depicted their opponents as wealthy fat cats, while others portrayed their enemies as overly connected, arch-conservative party regulars, or as dupes misled by Eastern, liberal, or foreign elites. Country music campaigns in the conservative Solid South, so-called because of the grip the Democrats held there for some 80 years, offer particularly valuable insight into the region's political history. Despite its reputation, the one-party South did undergo fits and stages of rebellion in which outsider figures challenged the elite for control within the Democratic Party. Many of these outsiders used old-time hillbilly and country music to signal their connection with poorer and less powerful constituencies who sought to take on the elite. Often these intra-party rebellions were put down, but when they were successful, the ostensible outsiders restored political peace by putting aside their more egalitarian notions about race and class and embracing the narrative of a Confederate lost cause, as well as a heightened nostalgia for the Old South. When it came to issues of enfranchisement and African American rights, several Southern country music politicians ended up siding with the very power structure that they generally opposed. These ironies and contradictions abounded among performer politicians and non-performer country music campaigners in terms of the traditionalism or crossover appeal of the music styles they deployed. Folsom, probably the most liberal governor in the South, adhered to a traditional string band lineup, whereas the Alabamians, the band of right-wing Wallace, sometimes employed trumpets and pop songs. Left-wing Glenn Taylor borrowed much from the Bing Crosby cowboy repertoire and sought a crossover sound, while conservative Pappy O'Daniel preferred traditional Texas fiddle. These choices could raise hot-button concerns about authenticity. Some musical performances were pounced on by opponents. For example, Jimmy Davis, whose early recordings were attacked as too bawdy and, by insinuation, too black, and George Wallace's Alabamians, who tended to be too pop and therefore not authentic enough for some critics' tastes. Others, such as Huey Long and Glenn Taylor, deliberately poked holes in this binary by mixing and matching and trotting out a wide variety of musical styles and racial and ethnic influences. Because much of the political history of the United States has been relegated to candidates and figures who were white and male, most of the politicians and performers profiled here are white men. This does not mean, though, that African Americans, women, and others were unaffected or uninvolved in these developments. We see inklings of early black-white musical interaction and interchange in Tom Watson's stories about playing fiddlesticks with black musicians. Bona fide black stars of country music, such as DeFord Bailey, did not follow their peers on the Opry in making political endorsements, being either too weary of the toll that taking a political stand in the South might require of a black man, or too smart to risk the end of a career for some quick cash. Charlie Pride was one later figure who avoided formal politics, even if he was conscientious and brave in frankly spelling out many of the injustices facing blacks. One exception, perhaps, was O.B. McClinton, a recording star known for chart climbers such as Don't Let the Green Grass Fool You, who campaigned for Edmund Muskie in Florida in 1972. Systems of racism and oppression made an impact on the white politicians as well. White Glenn Taylor, a sitting U.S. Senator, was arrested for trying to speak to an integrated audience in Alabama in 1948. Segregationist Governor George Wallace used his connections with Jim Crow in the South as means of attracting angry white voters nationally at the very same time that important figures such as Freddie Fender and Charlie Pride were beginning to challenge the racial boundaries of the genre. A few female performers and politicians are also part of this story. Like the white male politicians she supported, Opry comedian Minnie Pearl achieved a certain status and position of her own, but in endorsing racist candidates, she also shares some of the blame for perpetuating the ugly system of separate but equal. Country music opened doors to female politicians, helping promote the first elected woman senator, Arkansas's Hattie Caraway, and the second female governor elected in a general election, Alabama's Lurleen Wallace, though some have depicted Caraway and Wallace as damsels in distress who were rescued or shepherded by powerful political men. Both women broke barriers and maneuvered themselves into coveted positions on the national political stage, despite the obstacles posed by powerful male political patrons and traditional notions about women's roles. Both, too, share in the blame for encouraging separate but equal policies. Other politically minded women, national barn dance star Lulu Bell Wiseman, for instance, put their faith in Southern moderates who hoped to forge a path out of discrimination and poverty, even if later, as a politician, Wiseman found herself caught in an uproar about the Equal Rights Amendment. Country music in American politics has embraced a tremendous array of powerful themes. Some early politicians in this vein were populists. Many styled themselves as outsiders. Some were anti-Semites, and some were political kingpins. What they all held in common was a belief that stylistic choices in music could be used to establish authenticity. Politicians who used fiddlers and cowboy and hillbilly bands to attract crowds signaled that they were themselves political outsiders and thus well equipped to understand the problems of common people. This initially resonated with liberal policies such as support for old age pensions and opposition to poll taxes. The apotheosis of this left-wing politics was a poor young radio cowboy singer from Idaho named Glenn Taylor, who used his performance of pop-influenced country songs to raise public awareness about a range of issues. But influence was a two-way street. Agrarianism, one of the most prominent political and intellectual ideologies to arise out of Southern literary and academic circles, criticized the commercial aspects of the genre, but also heightened tensions over authenticity and reinforced a hard line regarding rights and race. Over time, populism began to give way to scapegoating, xenophobia, and segregation, even if elements of the original vision remained. In the process, country music attained a new level of cultural and political significance, one we can only begin to understand by examining its roots. Part 1. Fire on the Mountain. The initial surge of old-time and hillbilly music campaigns. Fire on the mountain, run, boys, run. Fire on the mountain till the day is done. Fire on the mountain, water down below. Never get to heaven lest you jump Jim Crow. Variant of Fire on the Mountain, traditional fiddle tune. 1. Like Orpheus. The 19th century encounters the 20th. In the beginning, it was amateur fiddlers who introduced what would become known as country music to the American political campaign. Robert Love Taylor, known as Bob to his supporters, was most probably the first in 1878. Using the fiddle to entertain his guests after giving lengthy political speeches, Taylor would win a congressional seat representing his East Tennessee district, partly on the merits of his ability to play fiddle. Like Orpheus, one paper would later proclaim somewhat exaggeratedly, he owes his success to his musical powers. Taylor would go on to be elected governor of Tennessee, helping to create a legend about campaign fiddling with his politician brother, Alf. 4 years later, in 1882, Tom Watson, the former country lawyer mentioned in the opening of this book, performed fiddle at barn dances in his efforts to win votes in his bid for a seat in Georgia's state house. The Atlanta Constitution noted that Watson demonstrated how potent the fiddle is. Watson would eventually shed his early affiliations with the Democratic Party, becoming known nationally as a perennial candidate and firebrand for the Populist Party. The evidence surrounding these early campaigns is fragmentary, but we can make some generalizations. We know Taylor and Watson came from the upper economic echelons of their rural hometowns, but had experienced at least some poverty, and had used music to attract a wider and more economically diverse audience. For Watson in particular, his music seemed to be linked, at least tangentially, with efforts to win over black voters. Both men seem to have been self-taught in their fiddling, and though accounts vary, neither was a virtuoso. We also know that regardless of how much or how often they actually played during these early campaigns, fiddling became an important part of their image, so much so that writers and journalists frequently invoked the image of their youthful fiddle playing even after they had long given up public performances and settled into more established traditional roles as statesmen and career politicians. Beyond these basic facts, there is something peculiarly modern about the way Taylor and Watson fused entertainment, celebrity, and politics, despite the fact that their issues, reining in the power of the railroad and standing up for sharecroppers, as Watson pledged to do, or fighting for the rights of small-scale moonshiners, as Taylor promised, might seem anachronistic to modern observers. Both quickly realized that their musicianship was a double-edged sword which could help them win votes, but also opened them up to criticism that they were not serious candidates. Both sought at times to emphasize, and at other times to downplay, connections that might be made between their politics and the music. Both realized that even a few performances on the campaign trail could go a long way in creating a public image that connected them with a hard-scrabble upbringing and an authentic rural life, and that once unleashed, associations between themselves and their music might be difficult to shrug off when critics attacked them for their musicality. Their stories also demonstrate that association with performance on the campaign trail could connect them with voters from specific regional affiliations and from backgrounds often lower on the socioeconomic scale than they themselves came from. And finally, their stories provide evidence that country music politics, even at its birth, could be used to buttress a variety of political positions, even if it also was susceptible to falling into a pattern of use by politicians of a more specific political stripe. Bob Taylor, like many of the figures explored in this book, focused on painting his opponent as an elitist, and used his music to entertain his constituents, as well as to connect himself with a rustic identity that appealed to voters. Taylor was not, however, a rough mountain boy, as later press might bill him, but rather an adult of almost 30 who was the son of a prominent eastern Tennessee figure, Nathaniel Greene Taylor, a congressman and Methodist preacher who had owned slaves and who had served as U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Bob Taylor had in fact attended private schools for much of his early life and was exposed to cities and experiences most poor Appalachian boys could only dream of. Born in his father's home district, Happy Valley, Tennessee, Bob himself had attended the Pennington Seminary, a prestigious private elementary school near Trenton, New Jersey, while his father, a Whig and a Unionist, took refuge there during the Civil War. After his family returned to East Tennessee, he attended Buffalo Male and Female Institute, a private secondary school in the foremost northeastern Appalachian corner of the state. In their affectionate 1918 biography of Bob, his brothers claimed he taught himself fiddle while attending the institute, but that his skills were not noteworthy. He lacked almost everything of being a good common mountain fiddler, save in the rendition of a limited number of tunes, such as Hole in the Kettle, Turkey Buzzard, Sally Ann, Shoot Old Davy Duggar, and the old version of Turkey in the Straw, or Natchez Under the Hill. But to any audience cultivated in music, or to any musical artist of great merit, our performances would have been exceeding crude. Of course, Bob could saw on the fiddle, but that was about the extent of his proficiency, except as stated above. After his time at Buffalo, Bob Taylor attended East Tennessee Wesleyan University. While in his 20s, Taylor had experienced some indebtedness and some poverty, never entirely succeeding at his attempts at farming or lumber and iron production after college. By the time he ran for Congress in 1878, he was studying law. Watson's family, in contrast, had seen its fortunes decline dramatically and knew poverty well. Born on his grandfather's plantation in Thompson in central eastern Georgia, Watson was a member of a well-to-do family of slaveholders. After the Civil War...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?